The first question is, I am a Muslim and I don't pray regularly. Reason being, it is not from the heart. I keep thinking of other stuff when I'm praying. What is your advice?
Okay, what is my advice? What comes to my mind right now is that about 18 years ago, when I first started practicing Islam, I had the same sort of problem. I would start praying and I would be thinking of absolutely everything except my prayers. I mean, it was so severe. I mean, it was like I could actually think about, what the Quran was saying, and I could think about, God and all sorts of things outside the prayer. But it was literally the minute I raised my hand and started to pray, I just could not seem to focus, and I couldn't seem to concentrate, and all sorts of things came to my head, and it was very, very hard. But the thing is, I didn't give up. I just, I stuck. I just kept with it. I found one of the things that helped me a lot was learning the last 3 surahs of the Quran and reciting them. That helps a lot. If you are just asking about concentrating in your prayers, then I suppose maybe that is slightly different from the issue of whether you are praying from your heart or not. If you mean that you're just doing it because you feel that if you don't do it, your friends who happen to be Muslims and your family who happen to be Muslim will say some things and you don't want them to say those things. In other words, you're doing it almost in a type of hypocrisy. You don't really believe. Is that what you're saying? If you're saying it's not really in your heart, you don't really want to pray because you don't really want to obey God, you don't really want to live your life according to what God says, because maybe you don't feel there is a God, or maybe you feel if there is a God, maybe he just doesn't care about us, or maybe you feel that the Quran is not from God. I mean, that's really the things that, if it's not from your heart, if that's what you mean by it's not from your heart, your issues are deeper. Your issues are much deeper than, I just can't say my prayers. You have to ask yourself, why? Why don't I want to obey God? Why don't I want to do the things that God tells me to do? Is it because you don't believe that it's from God? Is it because you don't really believe that God's threat of punishment is a true threat? What, is God lying when he says he's going to punish people who don't do this and do that? Maybe you don't believe in God's reward. So the problem here is a problem of certainty. It is a problem of certainty. You are lacking certainty, if that's what you're talking about. So how do I get certainty? How do I feel more sure? How do I feel convinced that the Quran is from God, that Muhammad is the messenger, that these things that it says are true? That's, I've asked the questions, but a bit of a big question for me to answer myself, okay? But I mean, part of it is really getting knowledge. The big part of it is getting knowledge. Certainty, knowledge and certainty are 2 things that come together. When you study the Quran more, when you study Islam more, when you study the life of Prophet Muhammad more, when you look into these things more deeply, the more you study them, the more deeply you study them, and you ask people of knowledge and so on and so forth, then more and more your certainty will develop. One of the best things to dispel certainty, to dispel doubt and to increase certainty is knowledge. So that's one thing. As for if it is just like you're being distracted in your prayer and you can't focus and you can't concentrate, then one of the things you need to do is, first of all, I would recommend that you make sure that you understand what, this is something that really surprises me. I mean, there are Muslims who pray and don't understand a word of what they're saying. If I ask them, what does it mean, Maliki Yawmiddin? They don't know. What does it mean, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ? They don't know. What does it mean, التَّحِيَّاتُ لِلَّهِ وَالصَّلَوَاتُ وَالطَّيِّبَاتُ? I just say it. Well, I mean, if that's the case, then of course you can't concentrate in your prayer, because you're not really praying, you're just saying some words that you don't really know what they mean, and that's not what prayer is about. In fact, there's no disagreement amongst the scholars that the minimum amount of Arabic you have to know is to understand what you're saying in your prayers. In fact, the reason why Allah prohibited people being intoxicated while praying is, as the Quran tells us, the meaning of what the Quran tells us is, you will not know what you're saying. If you're drunk or stoned or wasted, right, you're going to be standing there saying a whole lot of stuff that you just don't know what you're saying. So if you're praying in Arabic and you don't understand what it is you're saying, it's the same thing. You're not knowing what you're saying. You have to know what you're saying, you have to understand. But prayer has a purpose, it has a reason. When you understand what you're saying, then you begin to understand that purpose and reason. I think that will be one of the first steps that you could take in, if you haven't already, in helping yourself with that. I mean, otherwise, without learning more details and talking to that person personally and seeing where they are and stuff like that, I can't give much more advice than that.
The next question, I'd like to combine these two questions. If there is a God, why is it that our prayers are sometimes not answered? Also, if there is a God, then why is there so much suffering in the world?
Right. Okay. Well, I mean, the answer to the second question is, I don't understand the connection between the two things. I don't understand. If there is a God, why there is so much suffering in the world? Okay. What actually, logically, is the connection between the two? What's the actual logical connection between those two things? Between God and there being suffering or not being suffering? Unless, of course, your presumption is that you shouldn't suffer. I mean, me? Why should I suffer? I'm so important. Or maybe you think you are God, or I don't know what you think, that you think you shouldn't suffer. So there is a presumption in the person who asked that question that you shouldn't suffer and that God doesn't want you to suffer. I mean, the question of human suffering doesn't actually tell us about whether there is a God or not. Does it really? Does the question of suffering actually tell us whether there's a God or not? Does the question of suffering make the brain any less organized? Does the human suffering make the alternation of the heavens and the earth any less amazing and in need of a creator? Does human suffering make any of these things go away? No, it doesn't. Why do we? What is the compelling reason for believing that there is a creator? Because we look at our universe, we see it works according to these laws and these patterns.